Cap Times Idea Fest 2020 is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors. Presenting sponsor, the Burrish Group at UBS, a financial services firm with global access and a local focus to pursue what matters most for its clients. Major sponsors are HealthX Ventures, backing entrepreneurs who are creating value with digital health solutions. Exact Sciences, pursuing earlier detections and life-changing answers in the fight against cancer. Quartz, health plans built with you in mind. And Madison Gas and Electric, your community energy company whose goal is net zero carbon electricity by 2050. Co-sponsors are Epic Systems and the Godfrey Kahn Law Firm. Other sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Home Savings Bank, Unity Point Health Meritor, Cargo Coffee, and the Forward Theater Company. Media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal and Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Please consider becoming a Cap Times member. Learn more at membership.captimes.com.
Hello, I'm Paul Fanland, editor and publisher of the Capital Times, and I'd like to welcome you to this session of Cap Times Idea Fest. This is our fourth annual event, but the first that we are presenting virtually. Our theme this year is 2020 Changes Everything. Given the local and regional impact of COVID-19, the resulting economic damage, and the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement, there is a lot to talk about. We think this year's lineup is our best yet. We believe Idea Fest has grown into a signature event on the Madison calendar. It is also an important showcase for the Capital Times, our locally owned and century-old journalism brand. If you're not already, we hope you'll consider becoming a Cap Times member. As a member, you'll have access to special Idea Fest programs plus benefits throughout the year. You'll also be supporting an independent and trustworthy local media source at a time when that has never been more important. Learn more at membership.captimes.com. I'd like to thank the Burrish Group at UBS, which is the presenting sponsor of Idea Fest and has been with us since the start. Andy Burrish and Jason Moss have built their asset management firm's stellar reputation by effectively investing for Madisonians, but also for investing in Madison. Their generous support of Idea Fest is but one example of their community commitment. The discussion you're about to watch, featuring Ruth Marcus and David Maraniss of the Washington Post, is sponsored by Home Savings Bank, and we are deeply grateful to them for their support. So please enjoy this session, and thank you.
Hello, Wisconsin and Capital Times Idea Fest viewers everywhere. I am delighted today to be in conversation with Ruth Marcus, a longtime friend and colleague at the Washington Post. I can't think of anyone who would be more timely to talk with for her insights on the Supreme Court turmoil the nation now faces and the important questions about the deterioration of justice and the rule of law in the Justice Department of Bill Barr, who has given President Trump precisely what he wanted, a Justice Department that's his instead of the nation's. Ruth has a keen eye and a fearless tongue and pen. Anyone who knows her has witnessed all of those. She's worked at the Post since 1984, educated at Harvard in law, has a law degree, and yet is a journalist, which warms all of our hearts. She's covered the White House and the Justice Department and edited in various sections of the newspaper, and now is an editor and a columnist for the editorial section of the paper, along with being an author. And her first insightful book, Supreme Ambition, Brett Kavanaugh and the Conservative Takeover. So welcome, Ruth, and I guess there's not much to talk about.
Yeah. There isn't that much to talk about. I'm sorry. It's kind of been so quiet on the court front. Boy, when we scheduled this, we couldn't have known, and we didn't probably even dare imagine it. I'm really sorry that we're not doing this in Wisconsin. Was really looking forward to that, but really, really happy to be talking about this important subject, but really happy to be talking to my friend and colleague, David Maraniss, who's just, there's nobody I respect more and would have a better time sitting around and chatting with him, either virtually or in person.
Oh, thanks, Ruth. And Wisconsin viewers might know it, but you have a family connection to Wisconsin, don't you?
Multiple family connections to Wisconsin. My dad got his PhD there and loved the University of Wisconsin, and was pleased when I married many years after that a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, my husband, John Leibowitz, who also worked for many years for Senator Herb Kohl from Wisconsin. So I don't think that quite makes me an honorary cheesehead, but semi-close.
We'll do it. So, we're doing this conversation in the wake or aftermath or deluge of the first presidential debate. I really don't want to talk about the debate because, there's really, everything's been said in a way, but the one central thread or theme that came out of that was the most important, in my opinion, even overriding policy, was the continued threat to democracy and the electoral process perpetrated by the President of the United States. So I'm curious from your perspective, studying sort of the guardrails of American democracy, whether you think they can hold through this period, and whether you look at what might happen in November with any sense of optimism or pessimism.
Well, I guardrails is the right word, and the framers set up a very good system of guardrails, but we are going to, I'm worried, very worried, see it stressed this election year, this election event, because we don't have just election day anymore, and this election aftermath, as we have never seen it stressed before. And we have seen it stressed before. You and I lived through, I spent 35 days in the aftermath of the 2000 election, helping orchestrate the coverage of the recount on the news side. But I am as worried for the democratic process and the resilience of democracy as I've ever been. And I come to this from the baseline of someone who generally is pretty convinced that things are going to hold and we are going to get through this. But the notion that we continue to have a president of the United States, an incumbent president, because it was one thing when candidate Trump talked about rigged elections, it's another thing when an incumbent president who is sitting in the White House and would therefore need to be dislodged if he were to lose the election, talks about sending people to the polls with the obvious overlay of intimidating people, says that if he loses the election, it won't be fair by definition, talks about sending it to Congress, talks about sending it to the courts. All of those have roles in our constitutional system, but we need to be very much on guard and prepare ourselves for the eventuality of a disputed election. And I am significantly worried.
And if that happens, how does it get resolved?
Well, it gets resolved in one of three ways. It gets resolved through public opinion, which will have a say, and which is why it's really important for us not to be alarmist, but to be on guard and to educate people, because we have the constitutional processes here are quite arcane. I can't say if you gave me a test right now, I would be able to explain them precisely to you. So public opinion is one, and educating people, for example, that simply because we don't have a result on election night doesn't mean we've had a rigged or unfair election, is crucial. The second resolution is through an orderly process in the states and in Congress. And the third is the prospect of court action, which we've already seen issues relating to the election going up to the Supreme Court. And we need to make certain, I am not among those, by the way, we will get into this, who thinks that Justice Amy Coney Barrett, which is, she's not confirmed yet, but I'm getting myself used to saying that, should recuse herself from this election result any more than from adjudicating election cases, any more than I think that Justice Ginsburg should have recused herself. But I think that the president's comments about why it's important to have his justice on the court do put her in an uncomfortable position, and he should stop that now, as if he's going to ever listen to that. But we have a number of ways to get this adjudicated and decided. The problem is, and this is the unusual setting we find ourselves in the aftermath of Bush v. Gore, Al Gore understood for the good of the country, he needed to accept, however flawed that case was, he needed to accept the implications of it. And he did, because he was a patriot and he understood the importance of finality.
Well, even Richard Nixon did in 1960.
Yes, in a situation that, by the way, was much more disputable, even, I think, than Bush v. Gore. We could have a conversation about that. Donald Trump doesn't play by the normal rules of political decency. So we need to remind people, in fact, of all of the potentially aggrieved losers or theoretical losers before who accepted results for the greater good.
So let's sort of get around to your wonderful book, but take it into the present to look at the context of that. I'm curious about when you saw the Republicans respond to what happened with Ruth Bader Ginsburg by sort of retracting everything they'd said during the Kavanaugh, or even before that with Merrick Garland, I'm sorry. Was that what you were expecting them to say? And what does that say about where we're at in the politics of the Supreme Court?
100% what I was expecting them to say, not because I'm that insightful a person, people can decide that for themselves, but because they had made clear that that was then and this is now, if now were to arrive. And the same people who argued months and months, remind ourselves, Justice Scalia, whose death created the Merrick Garland opening, the seat that Merrick Garland should have filled and would have been a great justice for now. He died in February. Judge Garland was nominated in March of the election year, many months away from an election and inauguration of a new president. The argument that the Republicans put forward before Justice Ginsburg's death, that's completely different because this is a situation with a president and a Senate of the same party, is just ex post facto crock, I think is the technical term for it. And they know it. It's just a matter of pure power. They have the votes. It's the same. It's not the same situation. It's a so much more egregious situation because, in fact, I would argue that Judge Garland should have been confirmed because there was so much time available, and that Justice Barrett, and this would be true under a kind of veil of ignorance. It has nothing to do with the nature of who gets to fill the vacancy. When you have a vacancy that occurs when people are already voting, it is not historically, the Republicans can come up with as many 19th century or 18th century examples as they want. They are not relevant to today. There has not been in the modern era a justice confirmed in an election year after July. Hello, we're talking on October 1st.
So your whole book is basically around the hearing. I mean, the center of it is the hearings for the Kavanaugh appointment. And we're about to go into hearings very shortly. It seems to me that they're going to be far different, but what do you expect to happen during these hearings?
Not very much. The Kavanaugh hearings were only, I'm struggling for the right word, exciting comes to mind. They were only controversial in the sense of really galvanizing public attention when the allegations from Christine Blasey Ford came out at the very last minute. I will eat my hat and all the law books on my shelves if anything like that arises about Judge Barrett. That is just not, even leaving aside the sort of sexual component. I don't think that that we are going to have last minute revelations about her. The hearings have become, Justice Kagan used this word about confirmation hearings when she was writing about them in a book review before she was nominated. They have become something of a charade since Republicans learned the lessons and others learned the lessons of Judge Bork, which is if you give full answers about your judicial philosophy, you just open yourself up to the possibility that enough people will find that philosophy to be outside the mainstream that they're going to vote you down. So Supreme Court nominees since Judge Robert Bork was defeated in 1987 have been extremely careful about showing very much or answering very much. So there is always a kabuki theater aspect to these hearings. With Justice Barrett, and she's not a justice yet, with Judge Barrett, it's even kabukier than usual because we know the count. We know that a few Republicans may vote against her because they don't think the process is right, but we know she has the votes to be confirmed. I think it's still important to go through this to try to elucidate what's at stake. In the Rose Garden the other day, when President Trump announced that Judge Barrett was his nominee, she gave an interesting set of comments. And the most important thing that she said was to talk about her mentor, Justice Scalia. And what she said is, his philosophy is my philosophy. So if I were Democratic senators, I would take her at her word on that. And I would go through Justice Scalia's decisions. And though she will not, I can confidently predict, answer them, say, well, Justice Scalia voted to say that the Constitution does not protect marriage equality. When you say your philosophy is his philosophy, do you agree on that? Justice Scalia said Roe versus Wade should be overturned. You say your philosophy is his philosophy. Do you agree on that? So at the very least, if we're not going to affect the outcome, because we're not going to affect the outcome, at least the public can get a more full picture of what's really at stake here, because the answer is quite a bit.
One of the threads of your book, along with the obfuscation of the Republicans and posturing, was the essentially dysfunction and internecine warfare among the Democrats. Do you think that will happen again? And do you see them tightening their sort of position this time? Or do you think that it'll be just flailing around?
David, we're talking about Democrats. They're never very functional, and they're never very organized. And I say that being married to one. Look, one senator who comes in for significant criticism in my book is Dianne Feinstein, the senior senator from California. She's 80, I think the right number is 87. She is not the forceful senator that she used to be. She did not do a good job in my experience, in my assessment, in handling the very difficult allegation that came to her in confidence from Christine Blasey Ford. She did not do a good job of marshaling and organizing her troops to combat the Kavanaugh nomination. It was going to be hard to defeat him, but she didn't help matters, just to be blunt about that. She is in charge. She remains the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Some of her colleagues are quite frustrated about that. Will this have an effect on the outcome? No, because we all know what the outcome is.
You know, you've sort of answered this by saying they're Democrats, but why do you think Republicans are so much more effective at the power game than Democrats?
Well, you know, it's interesting. If you talk to Republicans and Democrats about the judicial nominations wars, which I've been covering for 30 years since the Bork nomination and before, you actually get these two conflicting views, which is Republicans believe sincerely and fiercely that Democrats will stop at nothing to defeat candidates, and they're so much more ruthless than Republicans. And Democrats believe precisely the same thing of Republicans. So they're both kind of almost overinflating the capacity and determination of the other. But the biggest difference between Republicans and Democrats is that Republicans internalized the lesson of the Bork nomination. To understand what's going on now, you really have to go back to that 1987 event. Judge Bork was just for folks who didn't live through it and aren't as old as you and I are, David, Judge Bork was the conservative icon. He was the one of the first real advocates of originalism and putting that philosophy into action on the court. He was an academic and judicial superstar, and his nomination to replace Justice Powell was the first pitched ideological battle of the judicial nominations wars. And in that battle, Democrats outmaneuvered, outraised, because it became a financial thing. People will be astonished to know that the notion of having a television ad about a Supreme Court nomination was it was just viewed as so not done and so unseemly. People for the American Way ran one ad of very little money. Now, of course, we have multi-million-dollar competing advertising battles. Republicans learned the lesson of Bork. It really became a never again moment for them, and they were able to create the financial and intellectual and political architecture that ensured that the Bork event would not happen again for them. And they had an electorate that was really responsive to arguments about how important the court was as a voting matter. Democrats have just been unable to match any of that. I'm really interested in seeing whether that remains true this time around. I think that while the natural inclination would be to say, oh, there's an opening on the Supreme Court in an election year. This has always helped Republicans in the past, so therefore it will help Republicans now because their evangelical and conservative base understands that Roe is at stake now more than ever before. They'll get out and vote. I think all of those voters are already as energized and worked up and pro-Trump as they could possibly be. And so I see, if anything, on the presidential level, the possibility for Democrats that Justice Ginsburg's tragic and very badly timed death could actually help move women, could help move younger voters who were not all that hepped up about Vice President Biden. It could actually be, and I want to say this in a respectful way, but it could be a political plus for Democrats for the first time in quite a long time.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I think that a large part of the transactional support of Trump among evangelicals, among senators, Republicans, was this very point. So they're already there.
Yeah, I mean, if Justice Scalia had not died in the election year, if President Trump had not, then candidate Trump had not come up with the extraordinary and I think really quite unseemly device of a list of nominees that he pledged to choose only from. By the way, Brett Kavanaugh was not on that list, nor was Justice Barrett and Judge Barrett in its initial form. If those two things hadn't happened, I think it's very possible we would not have President Trump today.
That's something. Wow. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg, this revered icon in the progressive community, a role model, beloved figure, feminist icon. In sort of the wake of her death, it seemed almost blasphemous to talk about something that I'm sure millions of people were thinking about, which was, oh man, if she had only let Barack Obama appoint her successor, this wouldn't be happening. Is that unfair to her? And what do you think about that?
I don't think it's unfair to her. And I did write a column immediately after her death where I kind of wrestled internally with the question of whether and how to raise this. And what I said was that I think it is just terrible for the country. It's terrible for the Senate, and it's terrible for the court for Republicans to be ramming this through at the time that I wrote this, which was probably late Friday night of Justice Ginsburg's death or early Saturday morning. It was not so clear that that was a fait accompli. So it was really a plea to undecided Republican senators to slow things down. But I also felt compelled to point out, and I said with some hesitation and with enormous respect to Justice Ginsburg, that this was just a really disastrous calculation on her point. And I know she was very well aware that people were talking in 2014 and 2015 about what was perceived as the need for her to consider retiring and the importance of that because of her age and the stakes of the vacancy. She went to a friend of mine and wagged her finger at my friend and said, you tell your friends I'm not going anywhere. She didn't like that. She made a calculation about whether Hillary Clinton was going to be elected. It was a tragically wrong calculation. And it was, I'm going to say something a little rough. It was selfish. It is reasonable for justices in a court as closely divided and where the ideologies are so clearly delineated as this one, it is reasonable for justices to time their retirements so that the president of the party, same party that nominated them, can choose their successors. And I think that Justice Ginsburg should have done that. And honestly, we'd all be better off for it.
You know, I don't know the history of something comparable has happened before, but I'm thinking that maybe justices in the future will learn the lesson of that, and there might be more retirements before people die.
Maybe justices learn different. Justices look at their predecessors' decision making. So one thing that happened was that Justice O'Connor retired in order to help care for her husband who was ill, and I think regretted that she retired as early and soon as she did. Her health was good at the time that she retired. And so other justices were reluctant to go too soon because they looked at her example and learned from that. So I do think that justices in the future will be more, as much as we can all be, a little bit more aware of their own mortality.
So let's say that Amy Coney Barrett is appointed, takes the court. Then the Democrats win the presidency and the Senate. What do you see as the constitutional and political moves at play at that point in terms of whether the Democrats will try anything like adding to the Supreme Court?
I think this is going to be a very front and center question. And I'm a pretty restrained and moderate person. I have argued over the years in favor of keeping the filibuster because, I mean, I've argued in favor in particular of keeping the filibuster, which we no longer have for judges. When we had a judicial filibuster, so you needed to nominate somebody who could get 60 votes, what you got was less extreme judges. There is no way on earth that Judge Barrett or Justice Kavanaugh could get, or probably Judge Gorsuch could get 60 votes. But if you had that requirement, you would create more moderation, which is a good thing, not a bad thing.
That's gone now.
Now that you've gotten rid of the filibuster, you have an incentive to go as far to the left or right as you possibly can, as much as the traffic and the Senate votes will bear. So what happens if, as you posit, Democrats win the White House and the Senate? I think the first thing that happens is that the filibuster goes probably for legislation, because there's just going to be so much pent up demand. And and this kind of goes back to my worry about the impact of all of this on the Senate. There's just no more comedy. There's no more of the kind of Ted Kennedy, Orrin Hatch, buddy, let's, we'll go and have a drink afterwards. I don't think Senator Hatch drinks. We'll figure out a compromise in the middle. That doesn't happen. We're just in the point of raw power. So first, the filibuster goes. Then we have this pitched battle in which many Democrats, myself and many others who care about the future of the court, myself included, would be very leery about opening the door to a kind of continuing cycle of court expansion or court packing. And I understand that. I think that, however, that what we've had here is stealth court packing. We had one seat that was stolen from Merrick Garland, who, by the way, was the kind of nominee who could have and should have gotten 60 votes. And we have one seat that's stolen by ramming through Judge Barrett on the eve of an election. So to then accuse Democrats, if they want to expand the court, of court packing makes it appear as if there wasn't something that happened to the court that was unseemly and really unacceptable beforehand. I would try to think through, and I don't have this solution well crafted yet, something that could even up the playing field to some extent. Of course, even if you added 2 additional justices, that wouldn't make things even. That would just make things a little bit more fair. You'd still have a significant conservative majority. To do it in a temporary way, to do it in a way that somehow sets up term limits. I understand that the Constitution protects life tenure for judges, but there are ways to think about having self-imposed term limits even within that, to try to come up with something that does not further inflame things, but that levels out the playing field. This is going to be a knockdown, drag-out fight. You can already see that this is not a subject that Vice President Biden wants to address. Court packing just has an odor around it.
He alluded it pretty well in the debate.
He did, and I think it's. I want
to though, right?
If I were he, I would not answer the question, and if I were Trump or Chris Wallace or a future debate moderator, I'd keep asking it because it's a totally legitimate question.
Yes. Okay, we're going to take a short break here and come back to talk more about Justice Kavanaugh in your book and Attorney General Bill Barr.
Cap Times Idea Fest 2020 is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors. Presenting sponsor, the Burrish Group at UBS, a financial services firm with global access and a local focus to pursue what matters most for its clients. Major sponsors are HealthX Ventures, backing entrepreneurs who are creating value with digital health solutions. Exact Sciences, pursuing earlier detections and life-changing answers in the fight against cancer. Quartz, health plans built with you in mind. And Madison Gas and Electric, your community energy company whose goal is net zero carbon electricity by 2050. Co-sponsors are Epic Systems and the Godfrey Kahn Law Firm. Other sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Home Savings Bank, Unity Point Health Meritor, Cargo Coffee, and the Forward Theater Company. Media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal and Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Please consider becoming a Cap Times member. Learn more at membership.captimes.com.
Ruth, you write honestly in your book about your relationship with Brett Kavanaugh and that he was once a source of yours during an earlier period. But you also write about his role in sort of furthering the notion of Clinton involvement in the death of Vince Foster. Even if he didn't really believe it, he was pushing that notion in terms of whether Foster committed suicide or was murdered. It was really kind of an early birther moment that he was part of. Talk about that.
Brett Kavanaugh is a really interesting figure because, and I did not really understand this very well until I started reporting for the book. He was not, when he was in college or even in law school, and he was in law school, by the way, at Yale, where while Judge Bork, who had been a professor at Yale Law School, while that whole nomination was going on,
yes.
nobody remembers him having any views about this. Nobody remembers him having any significant political or ideological views whatsoever. They kind of understood him to be vaguely conservative, but not rabidly conservative. And they mostly thought he was a guy who liked to drink beer and play basketball. He lived in a house with a bunch of other guys who were known as the tall boys, though Justice Kavanaugh is not particularly
better than the Proud Boys. But...
Yeah, they were not Proud Boys. They were tall boys. Some of them are now liberal judges on the bench. So he did not spring up in the sort of Federalist Society, which had only just started then, model of committed ideological conservatives. He clerked initially for a very moderate Republican appointee judge, but it was really in the Starr investigation, Kenneth Starr, who was the independent counsel investigating President Clinton, including his purview kept mushrooming, and it mushroomed to include the death of Vince Foster, who, for those who don't remember that, I had to explain it to my daughters a while ago. They were like, who? Yes. Vince Foster was the deputy counsel in the Clinton White House. He was an old friend of the Clintons, a law partner and very close friend of Hillary Clinton's. He tragically committed suicide early on in the Clinton administration because he had been the subject of vicious attacks over his, where he felt responsible for not dealing adequately with some scandals, early scandals of the
scandals in quotes. I mean,
yes, scandals in quotes. I was hoping my tone could convey that. And it was a really horrible, I think, early birther moment captures it, but not even quite, because it really inflicted so much pain on his family, on his surviving wife, on his sister, who, by the way, wrote a wonderful op-ed in the Washington Post when Donald Trump, as a candidate, was talking about running against Hillary Clinton, was talking about Vince Foster's death. It took years, I think it was 3 years of investigating that Brett Kavanaugh was responsible for, to put these scurrilous rumors that Vince Foster had killed himself firmly to bed. Of course, nothing is ever put to bed in our current conspiracy theory environment. And Kavanaugh, to some extent, was following orders by continuing this investigation to cover every thread and make sure they had dotted every I and crossed every T. But his broader experience with investigating the Clintons and working for Ken Starr really evoked a passionate hatred of the Clintons that we saw, for example, in that memorable attack on them and eruption at his confirmation hearings. And it inspired a sense of kind of passionate Republican identified activism that had not previously been evident. And so that was a really central moment of his life, his work investigating the Clintons, not just the Vince Foster death, but more broadly investigating Bill Clinton's involvement with Monica Lewinsky, involvements in quotes too, and whether he committed perjury in the grand jury or elsewhere, as he was trying to put that piece of his activities away. This just really created a new and much more ideological Brett Kavanaugh. It was really striking to his friends at the time.
That's very valuable history. I'm curious about that in the sense of, so you had him as sort of a cipher or hard to pigeonhole in law school, and then being radicalized to an extent during the working for Ken Starr. And then you have, I'm sorry, go on.
I interrupted you, but he was radicalized by the Clintons and his disdain for the Clintons and working for Ken Starr, and something else was going on, which was increasing role of the Federalist Society, the conservative legal group that has become really the kind of official judge pickers for the Trump administration, but played a significant role in the Bush White House as well. Brett Kavanaugh, early on, during the time that he was working for Ken Starr, started sort of talking to friends quietly about his ambition to someday be on the Supreme Court. This was somewhat surprising because he was not the sort of star student at Yale Law School. He's quite smart and he was a good student at Yale Law School, but not a legal superstar back then. But he both had this radicalizing experience that made him much more conservative, I think, than he had previously expressed working for Ken Starr. And he simultaneously understood that adherence to this conservative judicial philosophy, which was pretty comfortable for him, was also going to be a very helpful ticket to getting first an appeals court judgeship and then ultimately to the Supreme Court.
So as you watch that transformation of him, and then you've seen him on the Supreme Court itself, has his behavior on the court, his actions on the court in any way reflected anything that surprised you?
Not really. I think that you can't really tell very much about any justice from his or her first term on the court. They do evolve. I think this is particularly true of Justice Kavanaugh. We've now had 2 of his terms on the court. He has voted much more than any other justice. In fact, the most common justice pairing, the agreement is strongest between him and between Brett Kavanaugh and the Chief Justice than between any 2 other justices. And so, which is
somewhat more moderate, right?
Which is somewhat more moderate. It was truer in the first term on the court, I believe, than in the second term. Significantly in Justice Kavanaugh's second term on the court, in the cases that really matter, the highest profile cases, in the DACA case involving the Trump era protections for Dreamers, in the case involving the constitutionality of the Louisiana abortion law, in the previous term, in the case about whether a citizenship question could be added to the census. In all of the really critical cases where the Chief Justice disappointed conservatives and, in fact, enraged some of them, they saw him as incorrectly as a traitor to the cause. He's a very conservative justice. He's going to continue to be a very conservative justice. Justice Kavanaugh was not with him on those. But he did not want, I believe, to make a ton of waves in his first term on the court. The experience of the confirmation hearings as they turned out were incredibly searing for him. It really affected his ability to go out in the world, to go to a Nats game when we used to be able to do that and have a beer like a quasi-normal person. And so he wanted to show very much that unlike the experience really for Justice Thomas, who's the only other justice we've seen go through a confirmation hearing of that emotion and intensity, that it didn't embitter him. He kept telling his friends he wanted to be the same justice he had always been. And so I think he started with a sort of go slow mentality. He had a more conservative term on the court in this second term. And the really interesting thing is going to be to watch what happens in this next term, assuming that there is a 6-justice conservative majority. Because I called my book when I originally wrote it, and it is still called Brett Kavanaugh and the Conservative Takeover. Yes. I believe that is correct. But I have to say, as I was working on the paperback edition this summer, as the court was surprising us quite a bit on some cases, and one of the ones I didn't mention where Justice Kavanaugh and the Chief Justice also disagreed had to do with the protection in federal anti-discrimination law for gay, lesbian, and transgender employees. He and the Chief Justice disagreed about that. So I had to wrestle with the question of, did I overstate this? Was this actually a conservative takeover? I believe that it was, and I believe that we would have seen that even without the loss of Justice Ginsburg and the addition of Justice Barrett. But boy, you can do a lot more with 6 than you can with 5, because 5 is tentative. You could lose somebody over something. 6 gives you padding, and also it empowers those on the conservative side of the court who are much more energetic, much more interested in jettisoning Supreme Court precedents that they don't agree with. I'm not just talking about Roe, I'm talking about a whole bunch of other precedents. It really empowers that side of the court. And
it puts a ton more pressure on Roberts, right? Who would like to write the majority opinions. And
he has been the center of the court. He is not just the Chief Justice, but the swing justice.
But there might not be one anymore.
His swinginess is diminished.
Yes. Let's talk about some of the other figures that roil through your book. Mitch McConnell, pretty clearly, his whole thing is the long game, right? And it was all about the justices in a sense.
There are 2 things that motivate Mitch McConnell. One is remaining the Senate Majority Leader, protecting his majority. That was a big piece, actually, of why he was so committed to the Scalia filling the Scalia vacancy when it came up. He didn't think that Mitch McConnell did not believe that Donald Trump, of all people, was going to be elected president. He imagined that Hillary Clinton, if that vacancy wasn't filled, was going to be naming the Scalia replacement. But he understood it to be something that could help his endangered Senate incumbent Republicans running for re-election, that it would be a base motivator for them. Mm-hmm. So he, number one, cares about protecting his majority, and he, number 2, cares about, and they're connected in the way that I just explained, about stacking the court, not just the Supreme Court, but the federal courts more broadly with conservative judges. And boy, has he done an impressive job of that. I thought it was, my head was exploding the other night when President Trump, during the debate, was talking about the idiot Democrats and President Obama, who had left on the table 128 judgeships. They didn't leave it on the table. They were blocked by the Senate Majority Leader, who refused to fill pretty much any appeals court vacancies in the election year. I
didn't answer that either. I know. Yeah. That was frustrating. Okay, I have several others, but I'll just pick one other figure, and that's Kamala Harris, and she might be the vice president of the United States. What did you learn about her through the hearings?
So Kamala Harris is a really skilled prosecutor in the sense of just when she is questioning a witness, and this could be a witness in the courtroom, or we've seen it, her questioning witnesses before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they say something that gives her an opening, she is really adept at seizing on that and using it to her advantage. And I think that helped propel her into the public consciousness. She did have, I thought, a not great episode when it came to the Kavanaugh confirmation, where she had this odd line of questioning that people might remember about whether Judge Kavanaugh had ever had any conversations with anybody at a law firm concerning the replacement, and it was just or concerning the Mueller investigation.
Right.
And it was one of those, the one thing that you learn in law school is don't ask a question that you don't know the answer to, and she just didn't have the goods, and she couldn't bring it home. And I just, while it got a lot of favorable attention to her, I thought it was a real flop on her part.
I kept thinking she must have the goods, but
well, I looked into it. She didn't.
And getting back to that, and one of the parts of your book that's interesting, but was considered just process to the general public, was the amount of paperwork that the Republicans refused to turn over to the Democrats. In reporting the book, were you able to get back into any of that? And was there anything more substantive there, do you think, that we didn't know about?
The paperwork is, we were just talking about going into the archives. In some years, more of that will become available, but Republicans did a remarkable and quite brazen job of asserting that things that we should have seen, the public should have seen, senators should have been able to look at, were off limits, and they just powered their way through that. It was it's hard for Democrats to get the public riled up about process questions like give us the documents, but if you don't, and they did not do the Senate Democrats did not do a good job of bringing the stakes of that documents fight, translating that into reality for people, because if you don't have the documents, you just can't get the goods if they are there on somebody. I mean, not everybody has documents that are available. With Justice Barrett, and this is one reason that Mitch McConnell was initially quite reluctant to open the door to a Kavanaugh nomination, because Brett Kavanaugh had been working in the federal government for a number of years in places where you could obtain documents from the Bush White House, from the Ken Starr investigation, from the Justice Department, that it should have been a treasure trove of information, but he just got Republicans to agree not to demand it. And so they didn't. It was such a departure, as so many things have been, from past practice.
Yeah. Well, let's turn to Attorney General Bill Barr. You wrote a searing column shortly, a little while ago, saying Barr has gone too far before, but never this far. Tell us about that.
Well, a few years ago, a friend of mine who was working to defeat Barr's confirmation and I had a conversation at a private event. I was like, why are you going after him? He's as good as you're going to get. He was Attorney General before. I've known him since he worked in the Justice Department, and I was a quite young reporter covering the Justice Department. I remember walking into his office for the first time to introduce myself when he was an Assistant Attorney General as the head of the Office of Legal Counsel. And my friend said, no, you're wrong. Watch out. He's going to turn out to be terrible. So I email her fairly regularly, just with one.
Mea culpa.
You were right. I was wrong. Bill Barr had been Attorney General before. He was very well respected, and I use that in the past tense, in the Washington legal community. He told pillars of the Washington legal community, Democrats and Republicans, that he was going back to the Justice Department in order to protect its reputation and defend its integrity. And boy, could it turned out to be, whether he meant that or not, to be exactly the opposite. He has just transformed this department, which is just one of the great institutions of American government, into a shameful arm of President Trump, as in his personal capacity, not to defend so much, though this is very important for Barr, the institution of the presidency, but he's just been operating just to help President Trump, and it is so shameful, and it is such a disappointment for people like me who hate to be wrong, and we're so wrong about him.
You know, there are so many hundreds of well-intentioned lawyers still working in that Justice Department. There always are. And I often wonder about, what would I do if I were in that situation? And you're a lawyer. What would you do if you were there working, say, in the Civil Rights Division or something, and this is going on?
I am related to some people who continue to work in the Department of Justice.
I didn't know that.
And they are doing justice. They are prosecuting cases against criminals and keeping the public safe. They are bringing important cases against polluters or something. I mean, I'm covering my face with my hands because it is a conundrum my colleague, the editor of the editorial page, and I, Fred Hyatt, have been having this debate for years, and I've written that everybody should, in political positions, get out of the Trump administration, including the Trump Justice Department, because he just stains and smears and tarnishes everybody that he's involved with. I think what you should do Bill Barr is making, when he goes out and attacks line prosecutors as kind of agents of the resistance for doing their jobs instead of sticking up for them, I wouldn't blame anybody for saying, I can't take it anymore. I highly respect the people, the line prosecutors and career prosecutors who were involved in the Flynn prosecution, who were involved in the Stone prosecution, who resigned rather than make arguments that they knew were legally insupportable. But if you are doing public service, if you are representing the United States of America and prosecuting cases, which is a big piece of what the Justice Department does, and you feel like you can keep on doing it in your U.S. Attorney's office around the country, I can't argue that you should go, but I wouldn't blame you at this point. Especially, I mean, right now, everybody who's there should just hang on, because hopefully we'll have a different president and a different Justice Department, a very different Attorney General come January. But he has put everybody in a bad position. The people who are in the worst position, by the way, are people in places that have been incredibly politicized, like the Civil Rights Division.
Yes. But probably, I don't know if you'd agree that compared with the EPA or many other agencies that have such long-term effects, the Justice Department can probably recover more quickly if there's a change of presidents, do you think?
I kind of believe that the whole of government is pretty resilient. I maybe the sort of flip side of the deep state. People who hang on, make it through. There's a lot of, it's like digging out after some kind of natural disaster, right? When you've gotten rid of regulations, it takes a long time. We've learned this at the Supreme Court, to put things back in place in a way that's appropriate and that will stand up to the onslaught of litigation that you'd see. I do, and there has been, and you lose in all of these agencies, the Justice Department included, a lot of expertise. There's a hollowing out. Maybe justice is more resilient and can recover more quickly. I really hope so.
There are so many comments and actions that Barr has taken that sort of are mind-boggling. The comment of sort of comparing wearing masks to slavery was one that, to me, sort of just proved the opposite of what their claim that there's no such thing as systemic racism.
The notion that you would that is what got me to say that he had gone too far before, but this was it. How I mean, there's the sheer science of it, because we all understand or should understand that mask wearing, and he wasn't just talking about mask wearing, by the way, to be fair to him, he was talking about various lockdown orders. But we have done this to ourselves as part of our kind of general governance with governors and state legislatures that operate under the rule of law. It is not so number one, we needed to protect the country by drilling back on our interchanges with each other and by closing down. And we could have a reasonable discussion about whether that's gone too far. But the reality is that whether it's gone too far or not, the notion that it is in any way akin to slavery in terms of the impact on people is so wrong, is so and is so offensive to Black people in America in particular. I mean, it's offensive to everybody, but it's just so I can't even come up with the words. Insensitive doesn't do it justice. And for anybody to say that is bad, but for the Attorney General of the United States, who is the chief law enforcement officer, who is charged with overseeing and enforcing civil rights laws, as you said before, to say that is just repulsive.
And then you had his threat to use the sedition statutes to crack down on protesters, which plays into all the fears of what might happen over the next couple of months.
Well, his general, there are two things that we should worry about, but I'm going to probably come up with more now that I've said there are two. The first is that his understanding of the First Amendment seems to be limited to the free exercise of religion part of the First Amendment. The free speech part of the First Amendment seems to be of zero interest to him at all. And the importance of ensuring the ability for people to assemble and protest their government. I mean, his role in the Lafayette Square assault on peaceful protesters will just go down in history. And the notion that you would then use federal law, which doesn't, dealing with violent protests, I'm not in favor of violent protests, is and ought to be a primarily state function. And when you use the sedition statutes with the implications of political views that are swept up in there, I know if you look at the precise language of the statute, it doesn't involve that, but nonetheless, it's not necessary and it goes too far. So that's one thing we should be really concerned about, is his cramped vision of the First Amendment. And the other thing that we should be really worried about, and maybe even more worried about, is that accompanying that is his willingness to be supportive of the president's false claims about the unreliability of mail-in ballots. And so he has been promoting the president's misinformation and amplifying the president's misinformation. And he's going to be representing, in theory, the United States' interest in making sure we have a free and fair election. It's very hard to understand how you can do that job if you are promoting this crap about rigged elections and widespread voter fraud, which does not exist. If you think that it exists, I would commend to you to read some op-eds that Ben Ginsburg, who is the leading Republican election lawyer, he's now retired, and he has been writing for the Washington Post about the myth of election fraud.
And I think even the Conservative Heritage Foundation did a study of voter fraud, alleged voter fraud, over many years, and found almost minimal amount, nothing. Well, I suppose that, when we were talking about what would you do in the Justice Department, I hope it doesn't happen, but that could be a real test of if that department is put in the position of defending Trump in a contested mail-in voter election. Who's going to stand up then in that department and say no?
Yep. This is cheery, David.
Yeah, I know. But I'm always skeptical, but not cynical, and I'm a lifelong optimist, and I'm having a harder time with that than ever these days.
Well, I do think that so far, and this is hard to say in the wake of Justice Ginsburg's death and the 6-justice majority on the court, but if there is one institution that has shown itself to be reliable and resilient, despite the fact that we've had so many judges named by President Trump and confirmed by Senate Majority Leader McConnell's Senate, the federal courts have been really impressive over the last 4 years, and that's where I put my hope. Even today, that's where I put my hope.
Great. Well, Ruth, it's been a delight talking with you for this hour.
Great to see you, David. I miss you in
too.
person.
Okay, and everybody read this book and all of Ruth's columns in the Washington Post. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Giving you a cyber hug.
You too.
Cap Times Idea Fest 2020 is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors. Presenting sponsor, the Burrish Group at UBS, a financial services firm with global access and a local focus to pursue what matters most for its clients. Major sponsors are HealthX Ventures, backing entrepreneurs who are creating value with digital health solutions. Exact Sciences, pursuing earlier detections and life-changing answers in the fight against cancer. Quartz, health plans built with you in mind. And Madison Gas and Electric, your community energy company whose goal is net zero carbon electricity by 2050. Co-sponsors are Epic Systems and the Godfrey Kahn Law Firm. Other sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Home Savings Bank, Unity Point Health Meritor, Cargo Coffee, and the Forward Theater Company. Media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal and Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Please consider becoming a Cap Times member. Learn more at membership.captimes.com.